close this little thing. There we go. All right, so I think we are ready to record. So Len, if you would like to share your screen and take it away, we'll love to hear what you have to say.
Well, Sarah, you did a very good job of introducing me. I've been interested in New York State history since I was a kid. I grew up in New Paltz, and anybody that's been to New Paltz has a sense of the significance of the stone houses there. And they always fascinated me. I always wondered who those people were who lived there. And I think it might have been that early experience that turned me on to doing historical work. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'll give you a sense of some of what the work looks like. Okay, so I thought I would show some of these, some of the paintings that I've done before. And for those of you who are familiar with my work, you're going to recognize some of these things. And for those of you who aren't, this will be new. This is a scene of a Mohawk, a Mohican encampment just south of Albany, about 4 or 5 miles south of Albany on the Papscany Creek. And this image was based on the archaeology that was done by Karen Hartkin and Lucianne Lavin back in the 1990s. The Mohicans would live down near the river in the summertime. They would grow crops there, they would fish there. And then in the winter months, they would move back up into the hills. And we know that these structures were there because of what the archaeologists found. This is a really fun painting. I just made this painting about 6 months ago. For those of you who know New Paltz, you might recognize the Schwangunk Ridge there where Mohonk Mountain House is located. This is the Wallkill River, and these are Munsee fishermen. And this is set in a time before contact with Europeans could have been between 1400 and 1500 AD. Archaeologists who have done digs on the native sites near and around New Paltz have discovered sturgeon bones, which is not all that uncommon. They've been found in a number of other sites. And sturgeon are immense fish. They can be 10 feet long. This is a sturgeon that probably weighs 200 to 250 pounds. And this group of fishermen have been working most of the day to wrestle it ashore, but it would feed the community for quite some time. This is a painting I did a few years ago. This is the Dutch fort in Albany, Fort Orange, as it may have looked in the 1650s. Again, archaeologists, in particular Paul Huey, did an excavation just prior to the construction of the highway that runs through Albany and found a number of interesting artifacts there, including the post molds of one of the houses and some of the stockade that surrounded the fort. This is a painting I made of a Dutch ferry. This type of vessel was called a veer ship, V-E-E-R. S-C-H-I-P. And they were common. The Dutch used them in the Netherlands, and they used them here in the Hudson River and down in the waters near Manhattan. They could probably accommodate 20 passengers. They would have a space below decks with benches for the passengers to sit while the crew skippered their way across. I did another painting of this vessel that I entitled the Staten Island Ferry, because actually that's what this type of vessel did. This particular setting is at night somewhere near Yonkers, probably about 1640s or 1650s. This is a painting of the East River in Manhattan, also set around that same time. This painting shows the offloading of a Dutch merchant ship. That type of vessel, that large ship, is called a flout. And in the background, the large building that you see, I'm going to use my cursor. I hope it's working, but that building that you see on the left side of the painting was the company house, and at the time it was the residence of Petrus Stuyvesant, who was the administrator for New Netherland at that time. This is all the East River. This is the Strand. The painting is part of the collection of the Fenimore Art Museum in Cooperstown. And this is a painting that I did of Manhattan. It's a view of the city from Governor's Island. The building that we were just talking about, Stuyvesant's headquarters, was that building right there. This is the Hudson River. The windmill was sort of on the banks of the Hudson. The East River would have been off to the side. All of these paintings are part of the exhibition at the Albany Institute. This is Schenectady, New York, around 1690, shortly before the famous Schenectady massacre, which took place in February of 1690. And this was done mostly from mapping that was done by a British surveyor named Wolfgang Romer. We're going to be getting into a little bit of how I work with maps in just a minute. As a matter of fact, right now. This is a kind of crude map that was made by a minister named John Miller. He drew this map in around 1695 of Kingston, New York. And although it's really somewhat simplified, there's enough information here to get a sense of what Kingston may have looked like in that time period. I was commissioned by the Park Service, New York State Park Service, to do a painting that was to be part of an exhibition, permanent exhibition at the Senate House Museum in Kingston. So using this map, one of the first things I did was take a map of present day Kingston, and that's the area that was occupied by the stockade. Using a whole bunch of different techniques, I created a digital model using the same density of buildings that were shown in the map that was drawn by Miller. And then from this, I made this painting of Kingston set in the late 1690s. It's a fairly large painting, and there's quite a bit of detail in it. The Ulster County building is located over here, and there's a cemetery in this little inner stockade area, and that cemetery is still located in Kingston. This is North Front Street, and for those of you who know Dyson's Bakery and Restaurant, that would be located right in here. The mill pond is long gone, and so is the little stream. The Senate House would be located right up in this corner today. This is one of the outlying structures, and I painted a building under construction out here. So that was a lot of fun to do because I grew up in New Paltz, and the stories that I always heard about Kingston revolved around its history that was said after and during the American Revolution when Kingston was burned. But there was very little, maybe nothing I ever heard as a kid about 17th century Kingston. So this was a wonderful opportunity to kind of explore that as a subject. A couple of years ago, I was commissioned to do a painting of Rondout, New York, in its golden age, which would have been in the late 1800s. And it was a large painting. It was to have a lot of detail. And so the research phase of the project was fairly time consuming. There are numerous references. For instance, many photographs, great photographs. I love this picture of the Rondout. This is Rondout Creek, and this is the Hudson River out here. What you see in here is a holding basin for D&H canal barges, and there are hundreds of them in here. Hundreds. It gives you an idea of the incredible amount of activity that would have occurred on the Rondout Creek using the D&H Canal at the height of its time in the late 1800s. Part of this building was going to be included in the painting, and this very unusual structure here. This is a coal silo here. I did take advantage of that building also in the painting. So this is a photograph taken down near Island Dock, sort of looking out toward the Hudson River. Island Dock itself with the huge conical piles of coal coming out of Pennsylvania and being stored there before they could.
Sorry,
Yes.
Len, can you go back one?
Sure, I think I can.
So
Yeah.
People who are familiar with Kingston, I'm pretty sure that building with the little bell tower is the old firehouse, which is now Flowers by Maria.
Yeah, it's still there.
Some
Yeah.
frame of reference for locals.
Yeah, beautiful little building, a great bit of architecture. This is not too far from where the Hudson River Maritime Museum is. This is the Skilly Pot, the ferry that crossed the creek from Conley to Rondout. This is down by Island Dock again. This is a floating coal barge. This is taken on the canal, but further in. But it shows the loading of coal into barges. This is Kingston from Conley. This is an interesting old photograph. This is the railroad bridge. It's been replaced, but this is the original railroad bridge over the Rondout under construction. So what you see under the main tracks of the bridge is this is all scaffolding that was put up to during the construction process. But it's an amazing bit of engineering. Again, another canal scene. This is an incredible document. This is a bird's eye view in the collection of the Library of Congress of Kingston and Rondout in 1875. And it is loaded with information, really great detailed information. It's hard to imagine how an artist in that time period could do something like this unless they were using photography and a balloon or something, because the detail is so good. This is sort of zeroing in on a portion of the Rondout. There's that coal silo that I pointed out earlier, right there. The structure is indicated pretty much the same way you see it in the photograph. And also there are some of these churches, most of these churches are still there in Rondout. Most of the buildings have been taken down. So modeling the site was challenging. There are a number of maps. This is a 1856 view of the Rondout. and my painting was going to be set several years later. So what I tried to do with this map was to coordinate it with the Sanborn maps. This is a Sanborn map from the late 1800s, and you can see that it's quite detailed. All the buildings are indicated, all the outbuildings are indicated, and upon more careful study, there are keys to these maps that indicate whether the buildings are 1, 2, or 3 stories and whether they're made of brick or wood. So there's a lot of information in the Sanborn maps. So this is taking that Sanborn map and placing it in the right location and the right scale with the 1856 map. In terms of the topography, Google Maps is great. This is that section there. There's the Maritime Museum right there. This is a wider view of the Rondout and the Hudson River. And I have a program that allows me to take Google site information, in particular the topography, and map it into digital modeling programs, which I use extensively for my work reconstructing the past. So there's the terrain surrounding the Rondout, and then this is the terrain with the Google image placed on top of it. So this was great because it gave me an idea of where all the streets were. Obviously, the density has changed over the century, more than a century that has gone by, but there's enough there to see some of what the old town may have looked like. The structures, again, using digital modeling. Now that's a detail from that Library of Congress bird's eye view, and you can see there's an amazing amount of information there. It shows all the gables of the roof of this very unusual Victorian house. And so using this as a basis, I was able to build a digital model to represent that particular house. And I did that with every building in the painting, every church, every warehouse, every commercial building, and every residence. So it took a while, it took months to do this. I blocked them out. They weren't done in tremendous detail, but they were done in enough detail so that I could get a sense of what they looked like and how big they were. This is a digital map, and this is that same map placed on one of the digital models of one of the commercial buildings. And there were rows and rows of them, and I could see that in the Sanborn maps. So I took a number of Sanborn maps and then put them all together so that I had a detailed image of a much larger area of Rondout than I could get in any one image by itself. And then taking that map, I started building all the structures and putting them in place. Now, you notice in this digital model that the surface plane, the ground plane, is completely flat. And anybody that knows the Rondout in Kingston knows that that landscape is not flat at all. It's quite hilly, and there's quite a tremendous difference in elevation between the water level and up into the town of Kingston. So once I had the buildings modeled, I had to place them into a terrain. And so that's what I'm sort of suggesting with this image, that the buildings are on a sloping landscape. The vessels, they presented their own unique challenge. That era of steamboating and sail on the Hudson River has always fascinated me. And one of the towboats that I always liked a lot was the Valentine. And there are a few photographs of it. I had these images, and from Don Ringwald's book on steamboats, I knew the dimensions of the steamboat. I knew how long it was. I knew how wide it was. And I knew how it was powered. So I had enough there to be able to build a digital model of it. The way I started the model was just kind of getting the general lines. This is the shape of the hull, the shape of the deck, the height and general location of one of the paddle boxes. Here's the pilot house located, and the stack. On here, I've started to construct the boiler, put in the upper decks. Pilot house is now roughed in. Now that all that structure is put together, it's starting to shape up. Added the hog frame, the shape and shear of the hull. And here's the digital model sort of coming together now with a few features. The walking beam is in place, more of the structure, and some of the stabilizing cables. The paddle wheel is in place. And here's the finished model. Now this is, it's not a perfect model, but it's a pretty good model for me to be able to reference and get a sense of how light plays off of all of those surfaces and how the shadows work. I did the same with the Albany, the Dayliner Albany, much bigger vessel, passenger vessel, not a towboat. And I did it also with the Mary Powell. And probably the Mary Powell model took me the longest because I knew that it was going to be featured in the painting. I wanted to get it as accurately built as I could. I built the Rhinecliff Ferry. There were several Rhinecliff ferries that operated over time in and out of the Rondout. And then there were a number of harbor vessels, barges, harbor tugs, launches, steam launches, and sloops. Part of the challenge of this painting was to create a lighting scheme that was interesting and sort of highlighted the features in the painting that I wanted to present and sort of focus on. This red line sort of indicates we are positioned about here, and this is our angle of view. So we're looking from the Hudson River toward the island dock, and this is the part of Rondout that was being depicted in the painting. So I worked on different ideas for lighting, trying some contrasty lighting. Here I'd roughed in a few buildings and tried a few spotlights to see what they might do. You might notice in this painting the barges are very rough. They haven't been worked out at all. They're just sort of blocked in. Again, more refinement. And eventually I wound up with a digital model of Rondout and these pools of light in different parts of the city to kind of move your eye around. The underpainting for this piece was pretty unusual. I think people who visited my studio were kind of wondering if something had happened to me. I started with, the canvas is very big, so I sort of roughed in the general shape of what the idea was going to be. And then I just went wild with color. I knew I wanted it to be warm. I wanted it to be punchy, lively. I wanted it to maintain that sort of color interest all through the whole process. So I just mixed up some heavy duty color and just applied it to the whole canvas and came up with that. And then on this, over this, I started to paint sections of the painting where I actually got in there and sort of really put detail in. So here I've started to paint, I've done this with complex paintings before where I can't really get a sense of what the whole thing is, but I understand what part of it is. And before I kind of give up completely, I chip away at it. I do a piece at a time. And over the course of several weeks, probably maybe a month and a half, something like that, I completed the painting. So this is the view of Rondout. You can see that the railroad bridge is there in the background, the one we talked about with all the scaffolding. The mountains in the background. The barges have now been worked out. Here's a harbor tug and a sloop. There's Valentine in the background. There's the Dayliner Albany and the Mary Powell featured here. The Rhinecliff Ferry, and there's that coal silo again, the one that we were talking about in the very beginning, and the churches of Rondout as they were in that time period, and the density of the town. Today's Rondout is not anywhere near built up to this level of occupancy. This is a detail looking toward Island Dock. Valentine and Albany are back here. And Mary Powell, there's the coal silo and the entire painting again, which you can see, if you're curious, you can see the painting. It's on exhibit in Albany, the original, and it'll be there until the end of the Albany Institute exhibition. But there is a print at the Maritime Museum that I think may be either the same size as the original or a little bigger than the original. And that's the final framed piece. And with that, that's the end of my program. So I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. And thank you for your attention.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Len. Everybody, if you have questions, you go ahead and drop them in the chat. I'll start by asking, well, actually, Rick and Donna have a question first. They want to know how big is big? They want to know how big the Mary Powell piece is.
I think it's around, that painting is around 50 inches long, which is big for me, especially with all that detail. I've done bigger paintings. You know, I was wondering, Sarah, what would happen if everybody who's in attendance unmuted? What would that sound like?
We can certainly try if you want. I can let everybody
and then you can
unmute.
just ask me questions. Everybody unmute and just, I want to hear you. I want to know you're out there.
And it looks like Betsy has her hand raised, so I'll let Betsy ask her question.
Okay,
I am most impressed with all the research you did and the modeling, and it's just incredible. And I'm wondering what your background is. Were you an architect, an artist, a computer person? You've brought a lot to this painting. What is your background?
Well, I am a licensed architect. I did that for a while, but I've been painting for the last 40 years. But I started out selling vegetables in my father's grocery store in Ohioville, and I found that experience to be very rewarding because selling paintings it's not exactly the same as selling lettuce, but it's a little bit like selling lettuce.
Really, really impressive. And it came through that you had been an architect to me. I just guessed that. It's amazing.
Well, I think what I really want people to be able to get into these paintings. I want them to feel like they're experiencing the past. Now, a lot of what I do is speculative. So I'm making, part of it, I have to just take my best guess at what it might be. It's a little bit easier after photography starts to become popular in the about the mid 1800s. But in projects that I've done before that, then it becomes more like working with documents, what someone has recorded, written down, or I find a great inspiration in looking at old maps, especially maps that have little cartouches on them.
How long did it take you from the beginning of the idea to completion of this painting of the Rondout?
I think it was about probably 5 or 6 months. And a lot of that time was spent in the front end of it, doing the research and then building the model. And once I get to a point where I've worked most of it out, the painting comes very easy for me. Now, when I first started 40 years ago, I would actually just jump right in and start painting. And that meant that I had to work it out while it was in process, in process of being created. And there were many times when I had to wipe the paint off and sort of start over again, where I would get something really out of whack. But with using the digital technology has helped me keep things in a very good relative scale. Before I did digital modeling, I actually built cardboard and paper models. So, and they would be, a ship model might be 2 or 3 feet long. I built a model of the Hudson River dayliner, Elida, that was about that length, about maybe 30 inches or so. But when I got into more complex projects, like there was a project I did of the Albany waterfront where I was doing it that way. I was building the model out of cardboard, and the model got to be so big I couldn't even set it up in my studio. I had to use a friend's warehouse to set it up. But once I got into the digital modeling, the scale was no longer relevant. So I could take on a project like Manhattan in the 1600s. I could model the whole city, and then I could place myself on any street in Manhattan. I could move out into the harbor. I could elevate my point of view, just depending on where I thought the good image might be. And yeah, so it's been a terrific tool for me. The project I'm working on right now is really fun. It's a painting set in 1637. Now, 1637 in New York is really early. Henry Hudson comes in 1609.
My family.
The Dutch built the first fort, Fort Nassau, in 1617. 1624, they build a fort in Albany. 1626, they build a fort in Manhattan. So it's still very wild. In 1637, 2 brothers who were Walloons, they were Belgian, were able to acquire a small piece of land way up in the northern part of Manhattan Island. At the time, that was the real wilderness. I mean, it was frontier. They built this farm in 1637, and I'm doing a painting of that right now. So I'm working with historical documents, and there's a woman named Sarah Cedar Miller, who for years has been a member of the Central Park Conservancy in Manhattan. She's writing a book about the history of Central Park, and she's going to be using this painting in her book. So it's fun to work on things like that. It's challenging and surprising sometimes. I mean, I don't know what these things are going to be when I start. I try to have an open mind and see where it takes me.
So you have the image, the drawing on the computer. How do you translate that to this canvas? Do you just go by eye, one section at a time, or you?
Yeah, the hardest part is is, I hate to use the word, but it's true. It's designing it, because all I have is someone saying that the house was 18 feet by 42 feet. I don't know what that is, except I know what the footprint is. That it had a thatch roof, that it had a chimney, that it had a stockade around the entire complex. This guy had a tobacco barn, and this stockade surrounded it. But one of the things that I know about life in those times is that they did not drink water, they drank beer. And anyone who had a farm would grow hops, and they would have to dry the hops. And one of the things that you notice in 17th century Dutch drawings and Dutch paintings are these small kilns. There's sort of a tower structure where the hops could be dried. So I knew it had to have that. I also knew that with any livestock, there would be hay that would be needed to feed the animals, and that when hay was stored, they used a structure called a hay barrack. So I knew that was going to be part of the painting. So I took all the components and just sort of roughly put them together in the computer, kind of guessing about how high they were and what the dimensions might be, how big this stockade is. So you can see that it's all very speculative. And all I did was basically build boxes, very crudely shaped boxes. And then once I found the angle that I thought represented presented this farm in its most interesting aspect, I printed out my digital model, lighting it with shadows like you saw in the Kingston piece. And then I would take that and just put the outlines of that into a drawing and then transfer that drawing onto canvas. So now I know where the stuff is. I just don't exactly know what it looks like, but I know where it is. I know how high it is. And so I just started painting. So it's, I don't know, it starts to, when something starts to work, I go with it. If I don't like it, I take a razor blade and scrape it off and start again. And then there are other tricks that I picked up. Like if I don't quite get a sense of depth the way I want it, in other words, a foreground that's much closer to the viewer and a background that's affected by atmosphere, haze, focus. I found a technique where I can use washes, oil washes that I make with different colors, usually like white with maybe a tint in it. And I can do a wash over, say, background trees or a sky that I want to push away from me. So I don't really know what I have until I get to the end. And sometimes when I get to a point where I think the painting is finished, I'll just leave it on my easel for a few weeks. And every day I'm looking at it, and somehow, magically, I get enough of a detachment from it that I can look at it and say, oh, why didn't I see that? That's really wrong. That should be much, much warmer, or that should be cooler. So I make those changes. And then at some point, because a lot of these things have deadlines, I just have to say that's good enough and call it quits. And that ends the project.
It's amazing.
Yeah, wonderful.
Len Clark, I think you already answered one of Clark's questions, but he asked, how did you pick a reference date for the Rondout composition?
How did I pick my angle?
No, the date, the reference date.
The date. Well, I wanted the railroad bridge to be built. The vessels that I placed in the painting, I wanted to have a sense that they were there at that time. Now maybe the year could have been, it couldn't have been much earlier, but it could have been maybe a little bit later. But it's pretty close to that time frame. It's not as far up as the late 1880s or 1890s. but it's not. It couldn't be before 1880 because the bridge wasn't there.
And then I have a question. How do you decide how big a painting is going to be?
Well, sometimes it's the amount of detail. These cityscapes tend to be larger, but scenes like the Muncie fishermen in New Paltz with the sturgeon, that can be fairly small. A lot of times it's working with the budget of a client. If somebody really has a desire for a painting of a subject and they can't afford a great big one, then I size it down to see if I can get it to a point where it works for both of us.
Mm.
So part of it is cost and part of it is detail.
Okay, Betsy has her hand raised again. Betsy, you want to go?
So early on in your show of pictures that you've done, you had a picture of a ship being unloaded and it had sails. And I think that the sails would have been dropped and furled when they were in port and unloading.
Not always. If the weather has been wet, sails were often dried. And they would be, I mean, you can go to Mystic Seaport and they'll have the sails out on the whaling ships. If it's been wet, rainy, they were afraid of mildew and rot. And also, you know, it's artistic license. But what I like to do is look at the paintings that were made by the Dutch, because I take my cue from a lot of that stuff. And the great painter, probably one of the most phenomenal marine painters of all time, was Willem van de Velde the Younger. And his work is amazing. He was a terrific artist and he really knew ships. And he made hundreds of drawings and paintings of Dutch ships in that very same time when those ships were coming to New Netherland. So I look at the way he depicts those vessels in port. And when I see something interesting, an arrangement of sails that look like they might be exciting to paint and catch the light nicely or create a feel of drapery, then I sort of pursue that sort of thing. Now, in the painting I'm doing of the DeForest farmstead in Manhattan, in 1637, he has a very small vessel. And when I say it was a sloop in 1637 is nothing like a Hudson River sloop. It's a small open boat, usually had 2 masts. And in that painting, there'll be no sails at all. It'll just be the mast. It'll be as if he's taken the sails completely off for repairs. So it's a question of aesthetics more than trying to make a photographically realistic image of something.
Good.
Captain Rick agrees with Len.
What'd she say?
He said Captain Rick Nestler posted in the comments that he agrees with Len about the sales.
His wife posted. He's like going, "Oh God, she's doing that."
That's good.
Anybody else have any other questions? Either you can unmute yourself and talk, or you can ask in the chat. Oh, Clark, do you want me to read yours? Clark just posted in the chat. He says, have you ever had a formal colloquy, am I pronouncing that right, with historians and archaeologists who specialize in the area and time frame of one of your paintings?
Always. I always start there. I mean, I over all 40 years, I've networked with a lot of really, really great historians, really amazing people who have expertise in so many different fields. The painting that I did of the Mary, that ship was, there's a historian in the Netherlands. His name is Gerald van de Werk, and he's in the north of Holland. and he had a small ship museum on the island of Texel, I think. And he's also been involved in a lot of the construction of historical vessels. He was the consultant on the Eindhoven, which is at your dock. He was the historical maritime archaeologist that was used in the beginning of that project. And he also worked a little bit on the Half Moon. But when I started thinking about doing a painting of Dutch ferry, I sent an email to Gerald, and he wrote back and said, I found one of these ships in the Zuiderzee. We found it about 10 years ago. It was pretty much intact. We recovered it. We haven't restored it, but we have on exhibit its frame and some of its decking, and they had built mock-ups of it. And so he had the vessel, the actual vessel. And when I was in the Scheepvaartmuseum in Amsterdam, I was doing research on a Dutch bark, but I had come across plans for a veership that were drawn in the 1640s. And so I have copies of those. So using the plans from the ship and the details that Gerald had uncovered from his archaeology, that's how I put that vessel together. So I'm very confident that the veership that I'm showing in that painting is pretty accurate. And I've done that with Lucianne Lavin and Karen Hartkin, who've done a lot of archaeology. I've worked with Paul Huey and Charlie Gehring. Lots and lots and lots of people who have made their life work one specific area of New York State history or maritime history, and have. I'm not a historian. I'm a painter and I'm an artist, and so what I do is I take what they know, what they have learned, and what they can communicate to me, and I try to translate that into an image to convey that information to the public. And so that's, I sort of see myself as a conduit between data and presentation.
Great, thank you, Len. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
How do you like my kitchen?
I love your dry goods storage. That's how I do mine.
Well, the dishwasher finally shut off. I don't know whether you could hear it or not in the background.
Yeah.
I'd like to know about your lighting. Your lighting on your face is excellent. What do you have for a way of lighting there?
I've got a gigantic studio floodlight in a corner of the kitchen over there. And I did have, when I do a zoom from the kitchen table like this, and it's in daytime, there's a lot of daylight that comes in the window, so I don't really need extra light. But now that it's getting on to evening, that wouldn't work. It would be sort of difficult to be able to make it look like anything. Oh, so I have to tell you a story. I did a program, this was about a month and a half ago. Some of you may have heard this before. I know Fran, my cousin Fran. I see you there, Fran. Don't think I don't see you. I did a program for the Dutch consulate in New York, and I did it, it was pre-recorded. And at the time I was playing around with a green screen. I don't know if you know what that is, but when you watch a news broadcast or the weather, that great big weather map is not behind that person. There's a green screen behind that person. And the weather map is actually on a computer somewhere. And the two things are being digitally put together. And that's kind of the way it is when you see someone doing an interview and you can see the skyline of Manhattan or something like that behind them. They're not actually there. It's just a way of putting it together. So I wanted to do this program. I wanted to make it appear that I was in my studio. and I don't have very good Wi-Fi in the studio. So I took a photograph of the studio. I set up a green screen, and I had the studio behind me. And when we pre-recorded the program, it went well. I mean, we went up. The program was presented to an audience. The pre-recorded part was played, and then when it was over, we went live for this sort of thing, for questions and answers. And like a jerk, I mean, I wasn't even thinking. I wore a green shirt. So my head was the only thing that was there. It was my head floating around in my head.
Funny.
I realized, I could, on my computer screen, I could see this. And I was trying to figure out how I could get my head in just the right spot to look so crazy. And at the same time that was going on, we were doing this, questions and answers. And we had a moderator, and there was another speaker besides myself, and I'm not paying attention at all to what the conversation is. And the moderator says to me, what do you think of that, Len? What Jeroen just said? How do you feel about that? I hadn't heard the conversation. I didn't know what the question was. I didn't know whether to ask. I didn't know what to do. So I made something up. And all I got were these blank looks from everyone. Like, where did that come from? So I decided it's better if you see like the macaroni behind me in the jars and this sort of real life scene than for me to try to do a green screen again.
Mhm.
You can always tell anyway, even when you're not wearing a green shirt, you can usually tell when.
Yeah, it's like parts of you are kind of disappearing,
Yeah, or it's pixelated, or yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I think we can go ahead and finish up. So everybody knows our next lecture is coming up in 2 weeks, Wednesday, May 19th. It's New York and the illegal slave trade during the Civil War era with Dr. John Harris, who's the author of The Last Slave Ships, New York and the End of the Middle Passage. If you joined us a couple weeks ago for John Harris and the Kidnapping Club, that was kind of like the prequel. It's funny they know each other, which I didn't know when I booked these talks, and I didn't know that they kind of followed up with each other. But John Harris. Yeah, John Harris coming up is going to be kind of the sequel of what's happening during and after the Civil War with the slave trade in New York. So that's our next one.
All right.
Hopefully you can join us then. Any last questions or comments before?
Yeah, on behalf of the museum, I think I join Sarah and everyone else in thanking Len for his generosity and his support for the museum. This has been a terrific presentation, and we appreciate it greatly. Thank you so much, Len.
Thank you.
And Mark didn't introduce himself. Mark Peckham is one of our board members, and he's known Len for a while, I think. So
yeah, good friend.
Yeah.
Appreciate it, Mark. Thank you all for participating.
Thank
So,
you.
Thank you.
We'll meet again in Kingston when all of this is over and we can see each other's faces. We won't have things over our faces.
I know. Maybe this fall, hopefully.
Yeah.
We'll see how it goes.
If you get a chance, come to Albany and see the exhibition at the Albany Institute.
And where is your studio?
My studio is in Nassau, New York, which is a few miles north of Kinderhook. I don't know if you know where Kinderhook is, but I'm about halfway between Albany and Pittsfield.
Okay, you're close.
Yeah, but the institute they have a parking area, they have a great staff, and the exhibit is we borrow paintings from all over the country to put that show together. So I hope you get a chance to see it.
Wonderful.
Anyway, thank you for your time and your patience.